In a quiet library, under soft light, lies a testament to a forgotten journey. It is a page from a medical encyclopedia, nearly 1,000 years old. The script is a cascade of elegant Arabic, but the knowledge it contains is far older. The text describes a complex surgical procedure with a level of detail that is both astonishing and deeply familiar to a modern physician. It is a passage from Al-Canon file, Tib, the Canon of Medicine, the masterwork of the Persian genius Ibn Sina. But this revolutionary text, which would become the Bible of medical training in the Islamic world and Europe for 600 years, was built upon a ghostly foundation. The original source for this specific procedure was not from Persia, but from ancient Greece, from the brilliant physician Galen of Pergamon, who had been dead for nearly 8 centuries. How did the wisdom of a long-dead Greek, written in a language few could read, become the seed of a medical renaissance in 9th century Baghdad? This was no accident. It was the result of one of the most ambitious and deliberate projects of knowledge transfer in human history. A pipeline built to rescue the wisdom of a dying world. In the 8th century, the intellectual inheritance of the classical world was on the brink of extinction. The great lighthouse of Alexandria was a ruin, its library a memory. In the West, the Roman Empire had fractured into a mosaic of warring, largely illiterate kingdoms. Knowledge was a flickering flame, sheltered in isolated monasteries on the windswept coasts of Ireland and Northumbria. Here, monks painstakingly copied the Latin scriptures, but the language of the great philosophers and scientists, Greek, was all but lost. The works of Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen were gathering dust, unread and untranslated. The intricate web of academies, libraries, and trade routes that had once transmitted ideas across the Mediterranean was severed. A great forgetting was underway. The accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of classical inquiry was one fire, one Viking raid, one generation of neglect away from vanishing forever. Simultaneously, a new world was rising in the East with explosive confidence. The Abbasid Caliphate had established an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Indus, an entity of immense power and staggering wealth. In 762 CE, the Caliph al-Mansur made a decision that would change the course of intellectual history. On the banks of the Tigris, he founded a magnificent new capital, Baghdad, a city built not from the chaos of conquest, but from a blueprint of perfect, geometric reason. It was a declaration of permanence and ambition. But this new empire, so rich in gold and faith, had a profound deficit. It lacked a deep, native tradition of secular, scientific, and philosophical thought. The practical challenges of governing a vast, multicultural state were immense, and the answers could not be found in poetry or scripture alone. The Abbasids were faced with a critical realization. A great empire could not be sustained by wealth and power alone. It needed knowledge. This was not a vague, philosophical yearning. It was a series of urgent, practical needs. The caliphs, their courtiers, and their generals fell ill and were wounded in battle. They required a system of medicine more advanced than folk remedies, and they had heard tales of the legendary Greek physicians. To build Baghdad's perfect circles, to construct its canals, bridges, and palaces, and to administer the complex logistics of taxation and inheritance across a continent, they needed the rigorous mathematics of Euclid and the engineering principles of Archimedes. To navigate their vast trade routes by land and sea, to create accurate calendars, and to fulfill the sacred duty of determining the precise direction of Mecca, the Qibla, from any city in their empire, they needed the sophisticated astronomical and geographical models of Ptolemy. The Abbasid elite understood that knowledge was not a luxury. It was the most essential tool of statecraft. This documentary will tell the story of how they acquired that tool. It will reveal that the intellectual explosion of the Islamic Golden Age was not a spontaneous miracle, but the result of a deliberate, state-sponsored, and fantastically expensive project to rescue, absorb, and ultimately enhance the entire corpus of Greek scientific and philosophical thought. We will argue that the caliphs of Baghdad initiated and funded a wisdom pipeline, an organized network designed to hunt down every surviving Greek manuscript, no matter the cost. We will follow the agents of the caliphs as they journey to the frontiers of the Byzantine Empire, armed with gold, seeking not spices or silk, but the precious scrolls of Aristotle and Galen. We will enter the heart of the pipeline, the legendary Beit al-Hikma, the House of Wisdom, a translation institute in Baghdad that operated on an industrial scale. We will meet the Christian and Muslim scholars who worked side by side, meticulously rendering the wisdom of one civilization into the language of another, and we will witness the electrifying result. How this infusion of ancient knowledge, far from being passively stored, was challenged, tested, and expanded upon, leading to the creation of new sciences like algebra and revolutionary advances in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. This is the story of the greatest knowledge transfer in history, a bridge across time that not only forged a golden age, but saved the intellectual inheritance of the West from the darkness. To build a pipeline, one must first locate the source. Before the great intellectual project of the Abbasid Caliphate could begin, before the first translator in Baghdad could ink his pen, a desperate search had to be undertaken for the scattered, fading embers of the classical world. The story of the wisdom pipeline is not just one of acquisition, it is a story of survival. It begins in the aftermath of an intellectual shipwreck, a cataclysm that had plunged one half of the Roman world into darkness, while leaving the other half the gilded, but complacent, custodian of a treasure it was slowly forgetting how to use. The state of Greek knowledge at the dawn of the Islamic Golden Age was not a single coherent library waiting for a new owner. It was a diaspora of ideas, a fragmented legacy residing in a few precarious sanctuaries, each with its own reasons for keeping the flame of inquiry alive. In the West, the collapse was near total. The fall of the Roman Empire was not merely a political or military event. It was an infrastructural and intellectual cataclysm. The intricate web of Roman roads, sea lanes, and courier services that had allowed scrolls and scholars to move with relative ease from Britain to Africa had dissolved. The great cities, which had served as centers of learning and commerce, had shrunk into fortified towns, their libraries burned or left to rot. The secular, state-sponsored education system that had produced a literate administrative class vanished, replaced by a world where survival was a more pressing concern than philosophy. Above all, the West experienced a profound linguistic shift. As the Germanic kingdoms rose, the sophisticated, bilingual world of the Roman elite disappeared. Latin, the language of the church and of a simplified administration, became the sole language of intellectual life. Greek, the language of Plato's dialogues, of Euclid's geometry, and of Galen's anatomical studies, became an alien tongue. It was a catastrophic linguistic divorce. A scholar in 8th century Francia or Anglo-Saxon England might have heard of the legendary Aristotle, but he could no more read his metaphysics in the original Greek than he could decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. The core texts of science, medicine, and philosophy were now locked away in a language that the West no longer possessed the key to open. An immense portion of its own intellectual inheritance had been rendered incomprehensible. What little survived did so in the most marginal of places. In the storm-lashed monasteries of Ireland and Northumbria, a different kind of preservation was underway. Here, monks, isolated from the chaos of the continent, developed a vibrant tradition of scholarship. They were masters of Latin and revered literacy as a sacred duty. They copied the works of the Church Fathers and the Latin classics with a level of artistry that remains breathtaking. They were, without question, the flickering candle of learning in a dark age, but their light was cast upon a very specific set of subjects. Their focus was, by necessity and by choice, theological. They were preserving the infrastructure of faith, not the methodology of science. While they might copy an encyclopedia by a Latin author like Pliny the Elder, which contained garbled, second-hand summaries of Greek science, they were not engaged in the active study of Greek astronomical charts or medical treatises. They were not philosophers interrogating the nature of being, but scribes safeguarding the word of God. Their role was heroic and indispensable, but they were the curators of a very specific and limited portion of the classical legacy. They were saving the tools of literacy, but the great Greek library of empirical and rationalist thought remained almost entirely beyond their reach and outside their interest. For that library, one had to look east, to the surviving half of the Roman Empire, Byzantium. Its magnificent capital, Constantinople, was the new Rome, a city that had never fallen, a direct and unbroken continuation of the classical world. Here the infrastructure of knowledge had endured. The great libraries still stood, containing texts that had long since crumbled to dust in the West. Greek was not a dead language. It was the living, breathing language of the court, the marketplace, and the church. A Byzantine scholar in the 8th century could, if he chose, walk into a library and read Plato, Aristotle, or Ptolemy in their original form. The state was a vast, complex bureaucracy that required a literate class of administrators, the logothetes, who were steeped in the classical tradition. The Byzantines were the conscious and proud guardians of their Hellenic past. They were, by any measure, the single greatest repository of classical manuscripts in the world. Yet, a profound paradox lay at the heart of the Byzantine intellectual world. While they possessed the texts, their culture was not, at this specific time, geared towards scientific innovation. Their immense intellectual energy was channeled into two other primary pursuits: theology and scholasticism. The Byzantine Empire was a deeply pious Orthodox Christian state, and the best minds of a generation were consumed by fierce theological debates, defining the nature of the Trinity or the veneration of icons with a level of philosophical rigor that was staggering. In the secular sphere, their approach to the classical texts was primarily one of preservation and commentary. They saw themselves as the custodians of a perfect, inherited wisdom. Their goal was to understand and comment upon the works of the great masters, not to empirically challenge them. A scholar might write a brilliant commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, but he was unlikely to build a new observatory to rigorously test and correct Ptolemy's astronomical data. This deeply conservative intellectual climate meant that while the library was safe, many of its books remained on the shelf, revered as classics, but not used as workbooks for new discovery. The Byzantines were the world's great librarians, but they were not, at this moment, its leading scientists. The final, and most crucial, keepers of the flame were neither in the West nor in the heart of Byzantium, but were a people who existed on the periphery of both. These were the Syriac-speaking Christians, particularly the Nestorians. Their story is the secret bridge, the indispensable link in the chain of transmission. The Nestorians were a theological branch of Christianity, declared heretical at the Council of Ephesus in 431. Fleeing persecution within the Byzantine Empire, they migrated east, finding refuge in the rival Sasanian Persian Empire. This forced migration was an event of world historical importance. It created a community of highly educated, Greek-trained Christian scholars and physicians, who were now geographically and culturally positioned between the Hellenic world and the heart of Asia. In cities like Nisibis and especially in Jundishapa, in what is now southwestern Iran, they created vibrant intellectual centers. The Academy of Jundishapa, in particular, became a unique melting pot of ideas unlike any other. It was home to a great medical school and hospital, established by the Persian emperor, but it was largely staffed and run by these exiled Nestorian Christian physicians. Here, the medical traditions of the Greek physician Galen were not just preserved, they were the core of the curriculum. But they did not exist in isolation. They were cross-pollinated with medical knowledge from Persia and, crucially, from India. It was a dynamic, multicultural, and practical environment, and it was here that the Great Translation Project truly began, long before the rise of Islam, because their language of faith and daily life was Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic. The Nestorian scholars had a profound need to translate the essential Greek medical and philosophical texts into their own tongue. For them, translation was an act of cultural and professional survival. They meticulously translated hundreds of key Greek works, especially those of Galen, Hippocrates, and Aristotle, into Syriac, in the process creating a rich, new scientific vocabulary. Thus, by the time the Arab armies swept out of Arabia and conquered the Sasanian Empire in the mid-7th century, the intellectual stage was set in a very specific way. In the West, the knowledge was mostly lost. In Byzantium, it was preserved but sequestered. But here, in the newly conquered lands of Persia and Mesopotamia, the Arabs encountered a community of Syriac-speaking Christians who had already done the foundational work. They had kept the Greek scientific tradition alive as a practical, working discipline, and they had already built the first bridge, translating a significant portion of this knowledge from its original Greek into a Semitic language, Syriac, which was closely related to their own Arabic. The embers of Greek knowledge were scattered, but here, in the hands of the Nestorian translators, they were not merely glowing. They were being actively tended, ready and waiting for a new patron with the vision, the resources, and the urgent need to fan them into a world-changing flame. The Islamic Golden Age was not born from an abstract love of learning. It was forged in the crucible of imperial necessity. The explosion of intellectual activity under the early Abbasid caliphs was not the pursuit of a leisurely hobby, but a calculated, strategic, and profoundly pragmatic response to the immense challenges of building and administering a global empire. The thirst for ancient Greek knowledge was, at its core, a thirst for solutions. The rulers of this new world, confident in their faith and secure in their military power, recognized that lasting dominion required more than just conquest. It required the tools of civilization, the very tools they found lacking in their own traditions, and saw glittering in the half-forgotten ruins of a previous age. The decision to invest vast state resources into the acquisition of foreign, pagan knowledge was a radical one, driven by a series of urgent, interlocking needs that touched every aspect of imperial life, from the health of the caliph to the foundations of his new capital. The most immediate and visceral need was for medicine. The early caliphate was a world of plagues, endemic diseases, battlefield wounds, and the common ailments that afflicted the powerful and the poor alike. While traditional Arab and Bedouin folk medicine, based on herbs and Quranic verses, offered some solace, it was hopelessly inadequate for the elite of a sophisticated, urbanized empire. The Abbasid court was a place of immense wealth and immense paranoia, where the health of the caliph was a matter of state security. A ruler suffering from a debilitating illness could not command his armies or control the intricate politics of his court. An heir who died in childhood was a dynastic catastrophe. The elite demanded a system of medicine that was rational, diagnostic, and effective. They had heard tales, filtering in from the newly conquered territories of Syria and Persia, of the legendary physicians of the Greeks, men like Hippocrates, and especially Galen of Pergamon. They learned of the Christian physicians, many of them Nestorians trained at centers like Jundishapur, who possessed a body of medical knowledge that was systematic and astonishingly effective compared to their own. This was not a theoretical concern. It became a pressing reality with the very first Abbasid caliphs. The founder of Baghdad, Al-Mansur, suffered from a chronic and severe stomach ailment that no local physician could cure. In desperation, he summoned a renowned Nestorian Christian physician, Jurjis ibn Buktishu, from the great medical academy at Jundishapur. Ibn Buktishu, a man steeped in the Greek medical tradition of Galen, was able to diagnose and successfully treat the caliph's condition. The event was a revelation. It provided an undeniable, high-profile demonstration of the superior efficacy of the Greek system. Jurjis ibn Buktishu became a respected figure at court, the first of a long and influential dynasty of Christian physicians who would serve the caliphs for generations. His success sent a powerful message throughout the Abbasid elite. The health of their bodies and the stability of their state depended on a body of knowledge that was currently in the hands of their Christian subjects. To secure this knowledge for themselves, to make it a permanent and accessible part of their own civilization, became an imperial imperative. The search for Galen's texts was no longer an academic curiosity. It was a matter of life and death. The second great driver was the challenge of creation. When Caliph Al-Mansur decided to build a new capital in 762 CE, he envisioned more than just a city. He planned a statement. Baghdad was to be Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, a perfectly circular city that would be the navel of the universe, a physical manifestation of divine order and Abbasid power. But to turn this grand vision into a reality of bricks and mortar required a level of mathematical and engineering knowledge far beyond what was available in traditional Arabic sources. How does one survey a perfect circle over a mile in diameter? How does one design the complex logistics of canals for water and sanitation, erect monumental gates and palaces, and ensure the structural integrity of the bridges that would span the Tigris? The caliph's architects and engineers needed practical geometry and trigonometry. They needed the principles of mechanics and hydraulics. They found their answers in the Greek texts. The most essential of these was Euclid's Elements. This was not a book of abstract theories, but a practical workbook for the real world, a step-by-step guide to the universal principles of geometry. Acquiring and translating Euclid became a top priority, not for the sake of abstract mathematics, but for the intensely practical purpose of building the physical infrastructure of the empire. Similarly, the works of engineers and mathematicians like Archimedes and Hero of Alexandria provided invaluable knowledge on everything from the construction of siege engines and defensive fortifications to the design of clever water clocks and fountains that would adorn the palaces of the elite. The Abbasids were embarking on one of the most ambitious building programs in the world, and they quickly realized that the blueprints they needed had been written centuries earlier in Greek. The quest for these texts was a direct investment in the urban and military fabric of their empire. The third pillar of necessity was administration and navigation. The Abbasid Caliphate was a vast, continent-spanning empire. To govern it effectively required a sophisticated understanding of geography and astronomy. Tax revenues from distant provinces had to be calculated, land had to be surveyed, and official messages had to be sent over thousands of miles. All of this required accurate maps and a precise calendar. Furthermore, the empire was united by a single faith, Islam, which itself had a deep and practical connection to the stars. The 5 daily prayers required believers to know the time of day, which was determined by the position of the sun. The beginning and end of the holy month of Ramadan was determined by the sighting of the new moon. Most critically, every Muslim was obligated to pray in the direction of the Kaaba in Mecca, the Qibla. In Baghdad, determining this direction was relatively simple. But how could a merchant in Samarkand, or a governor in Tunisia, find the precise direction of Mecca? It was a complex problem of spherical geometry, solvable only with advanced astronomy. The answers to these challenges lay in the masterwork of the Greek astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, the mathematic syntaxis, which would become known to the Arabs and the world as the Almagest. This was the single most comprehensive and sophisticated astronomical text produced by the ancient world, a complete mathematical model of the cosmos. It provided the tables, the observational data, and the geometric methods needed to predict the movements of the stars and planets with unprecedented accuracy. The Taishad of Nuth, that Nuth, it millioned the stainants with unprecedented accuracy. Conzalos and planets with unprecedented accuracy. Delitis TV these. Silly, Thimrvirzaries, Tikambirasi. For the Abbasids, the Almagest was not just a scientific curiosity. It was the key to a religiously observant and efficiently administered empire. The translation of Ptolemy, along with other geographical and astronomical works, was driven by the practical needs of a faith that demanded precision and an empire that demanded control. It led directly to the establishment of the first great astronomical observatories in the Islamic world, where scholars would begin the monumental task of not just using Ptolemy's data, but rigorously testing and correcting it. These 3 great needs, for the medicine of Galen, the mathematics of Euclid, and the astronomy of Ptolemy, formed a powerful constellation of demand. The early caliphs, from al-Mansur to his grandson, the legendary Harun al-Rashid, were not idle dreamers. They were hard-headed rulers who saw the acquisition of Greek knowledge as a strategic investment. They understood that to surpass their great rivals, the Byzantine Christians, they had to first master and then exceed the intellectual tradition upon which Byzantine power was built. This created a competitive, prestige-driven environment. A caliph who patronized physicians, mathematicians, and astronomers, who built libraries and funded expeditions to acquire rare manuscripts, was demonstrating his own power and sophistication. He was proving that his court, not the court of Constantinople, was the true center of civilization. This fusion of practical necessity and imperial prestige created an unstoppable momentum. The empire was rich, it was ambitious, and it was thirsty for a specific kind of knowledge that it knew existed just beyond its borders. The stage was set for the creation of a pipeline, a systematic, state-sponsored effort to import the entire intellectual treasury of the classical world and make it their own. The Abbasid thirst for knowledge was not left to the whims of individual scholars or the vagaries of the open market. It was institutionalized. It was transformed from a general desire into a focused, state-funded, and ruthlessly efficient national project. At the heart of this grand enterprise was an institution that has achieved a near-mythical status in the history of thought. The Beit al-Hikma, the House of Wisdom, located in the heart of the imperial capital of Baghdad. This was not merely a library to store old books. It was a dynamic, multicultural, and brilliantly organized institute, a national academy of sciences, and a translation bureau rolled into one. It was the central valve, the pumping heart of the entire wisdom pipeline, a place where the raw material of Greek thought was systematically acquired, processed, and refined into the intellectual fuel that would power a golden age. Its story is the story of how a civilization can, by an act of collective will, choose to absorb the knowledge of another, and in doing so, transform itself. The origins of the House of Wisdom are modest. It began under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the contemporary of Charlemagne and the hero of the 1001 Nights. Initially, it was a palace library, an expansion of the private collections of his father and grandfather, housing manuscripts captured during campaigns in Byzantium, alongside Persian literary and scientific works. But it was under his son, the Caliph al-Ma'mun, who reigned from 813 to 833, that the Beit al-Hikma underwent a radical transformation. Al-Ma'mun was not just a patron of knowledge, he was an active and deeply engaged participant. A rationalist and a devotee of Mu'tazilism, a school of Islamic theology that championed free will and reason, he believed passionately that rational inquiry was not a threat to faith, but a path to a deeper understanding of God's creation. For him, the acquisition of Greek philosophy and science was a sacred duty, a way to unlock the universal truths embedded in the cosmos. He poured the vast resources of the Abbasid state into turning his father's library into the world's preeminent center for research and translation. The first and most critical task of the House of Wisdom was acquisition. The pipeline had to be fed. Al-Ma'mun and his predecessors dispatched agents and emissaries on official missions with a specific mandate to acquire every significant Greek manuscript they could find. These were not looting expeditions. They were meticulously planned and lavishly funded purchasing missions. The primary source for these texts was the great rival, the Byzantine Empire. Emissaries traveled to Constantinople and other Byzantine cities, armed with diplomatic letters and immense quantities of gold. They were not seeking just any books, but a targeted list of the foundational texts of science, medicine, and philosophy. A famous, though possibly apocryphal, story tells of how Al-Ma'mun, after defeating the Byzantine emperor in a series of battles, made it a condition of the peace treaty that the Byzantines provide him with a selection of classical manuscripts from their libraries. In another account, the caliph's agents offered to pay for manuscripts with their weight in gold, a powerful statement of their value. They bought what they could, copied what they couldn't, and brought this priceless intellectual cargo back in a steady stream to Baghdad. Once the manuscripts arrived at the House of Wisdom, the second and most crucial phase of the work began. Translation. This was the core function of the institution. Al-Ma'mun assembled a dream team of the finest scholarly minds in the empire, creating a multicultural and multi-faith environment that was unprecedented in its time. The director of this grand project, and arguably the single most important figure in the entire history of knowledge transmission, was a man named Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Hunayn was not an Arab Muslim, but an Nestorian Christian from the Arab tribe of Ibad. His native language was Syriac, but he was also fluent in Arabic and had traveled extensively in Byzantine lands to perfect his Greek. He was, in short, the perfect bridge between worlds. His personal story exemplifies the meritocratic nature of the House of Wisdom. After being insulted and driven out by a conservative physician, he dedicated himself to mastering Greek, returning years later as the most brilliant medical scholar and translator of his age. Under Hunayn's direction, the process of translation became a systematic science. He understood that a simple, word-for-word translation was insufficient. Scientific and philosophical concepts were too complex and nuanced. A translator had to be a master of the subject matter itself, not just the languages. He established a rigorous methodology. First, he would gather as many different Greek manuscripts of the same text as he could find, collating them to create the most accurate and complete master version. The translation often occurred in two steps. The text was first translated from Greek into Syriac, the language in which Christian scholars were most comfortable discussing scientific matters. Then, this Syriac version would be translated into Arabic by another team of scholars, often including Hunayn's own son, Ishaq, and his nephew, Hubaysh. This two-step process allowed for multiple layers of checking and refinement. Hunayn's team was obsessed with precision. They understood they were not just translating words, they were building an entire intellectual world in a new language. Arabic, a language of sublime poetic power, lacked a specific, technical vocabulary for the concepts of Greek science and philosophy. Hunayn and his colleagues had to invent one. They engaged in fierce debates over the best way to render a specific Greek term. Should they simply transliterate the Greek word into Arabic script, or should they find an existing Arabic root that could be adapted to carry the new, precise meaning? This painstaking work of linguistic engineering created the very vocabulary of Arab science. Words for substance, accident, matter, and ether were codified, allowing for complex philosophical and scientific arguments to be made in Arabic with the same precision as in Greek. Hunayn ibn Ishaq's personal output was staggering. He and his school translated virtually the entire corpus of the Greek physician Galen, over 129, separate works into Arabic. They also translated Aristotle's major works, much of Plato, and foundational scientific texts on mathematics, astronomy, and optics. The House of Wisdom was far more than a translation factory. It was a vibrant intellectual ecosystem. The Caliph Al-Ma'mun sponsored and participated in regular, fierce debates, or majalis, where scholars from different faiths and different disciplines, logicians, mathematicians, theologians, and physicians, would argue the great questions of the day. The library was a public resource where any qualified scholar could come to read, copy, and study. Attached to the institution were two of the world's first astronomical observatories, built with the specific purpose of testing and correcting the data found in the newly translated work of Ptolemy. It also sponsored expeditions, sending scholars like the great mathematician Al-Khwarizmi to map the globe and measure the Earth's circumference. It was a place where knowledge was not just stored, but was actively tested, debated, and expanded upon. It was this dynamic environment that transformed the act of translation into a catalyst for innovation. The goal was not simply to read Aristotle, it was to understand him, to argue with him, and if necessary, to correct him. This critical, engaged spirit, nurtured within the walls of the House of Wisdom, was the true genius of the institution. It ensured that the pipeline was not just a one-way conduit for old knowledge, but a crucible for the creation of new. When the great mathematical and astronomical texts of the Greeks arrived at the House of Wisdom, they were more than just books. They were a key, a universal language of logic, number, and form that promised to unlock the very structure of the cosmos. The elegant proofs of Euclid, the mechanical genius of Archimedes, and the comprehensive celestial model of Ptolemy represented a complete intellectual toolkit for observing, measuring, and understanding the physical world. For the scholars of 8th and 9th century Baghdad, this was a revelation. But their reaction to this inheritance would define the very nature of the Islamic Golden Age. They did not simply become passive students of this ancient language. They learned its grammar, mastered its vocabulary, and then began to speak in a new and powerful voice, creating sentences of scientific discovery the Greeks had never conceived. The story of Islamic mathematics and astronomy is not one of preservation, but of profound and revolutionary transformation, a process that saw ancient knowledge pressure tested against new data and synthesized with ideas from other civilizations to create entirely new sciences. The bedrock of this entire intellectual enterprise was geometry, and the bedrock of geometry was a single monumental work, Euclid's Elements. Translated early and eagerly, the Elements was revered in Baghdad for what it was, one of the supreme achievements of the human mind. Its power lay not just in its descriptions of lines, circles, and solids, but in its rigorous axiomatic method. Starting from a handful of simple, self-evident definitions and postulates, Euclid had constructed an entire universe of complex and irrefutable truths through the sheer force of logical deduction. To the scholars of the House of Wisdom, this was more than a practical manual for architecture and surveying. It was a course in thinking itself. It taught them the discipline of proof, the importance of logical consistency, and the beauty of a rational argument. This method became the gold standard for scientific inquiry. The great physician Al-Razi would later argue that any scholar who had not mastered Euclid could not be considered a true philosopher. It was the essential foundation, the intellectual grammar upon which all other sciences would be built. But while Greek geometry was perfect for describing the static, theoretical world of forms, it was often cumbersome and unwieldy for solving the dynamic, practical problems faced by the administrators of a sprawling empire. How does one calculate the complex divisions of inheritance as prescribed by Islamic law, with its specific and often fractional shares for numerous family members? How does a merchant calculate profit and loss on a long-distance caravan journey? These were problems of unknown quantities, of relationships between numbers. They were, in essence, algebraic problems, and the Greek geometric approach, while possible, was often like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. A new tool was needed, and the genius who forged it was a Persian scholar at the House of Wisdom named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. He stood at a unique intellectual crossroads, with access not only to the newly translated Greek tradition of geometry, but also to another, equally powerful stream of knowledge that had trickled into Baghdad from the east, the Hindu system of numerals. This system, which we now call Hindu-Arabic numerals, was revolutionary. It included the placeholder concept of zero, cipher in Arabic, the root of our cipher, which allowed for a decimal system of immense flexibility and power, liberating calculation from the clumsy constraints of the abacus or Roman numerals. Al-Khwarizmi's genius was to synthesize these two traditions. In his landmark book, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hasab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the compendious book on calculation and balancing. Written around 820 CE, he created a new science. He took the practical problems of inheritance and commerce and sought to create a universal, systematic method for solving them. The very title gives away his method, Al-Jabr, which gives us our word algebra, referred to the process of completion, or restoring, the act of eliminating negative quantities in an equation by adding the same quantity to both sides. Al-Muqabala meant balancing, the process of cancelling out like terms on opposite sides of the equation. This was more than a collection of tricks, it was a revolutionary abstraction. For the first time, a clear and repeatable procedure was established for manipulating equations to find the value of an unknown quantity. While the Greeks had approached these problems geometrically, Al-Khwarizmi treated them as a new kind of object in their own right. He had created a powerful new language for problem solving, a discipline that was not dependent on drawing figures in the sand. His work was so practical, so systematic, and so powerful that it spread like wildfire across the Islamic world and, centuries later, into Europe, where it would become the foundation of modern mathematics. He had not merely translated an old language, he had invented a new one. This same spirit of active, critical engagement was applied with equal force to the heavens. The arrival of Ptolemy's Almagest in Baghdad was a momentous event. The book was a complete, mathematically coherent, geocentric model of the universe. It provided everything an astronomer could want, a catalogue of over 1,000 stars, geometric models to predict the motion of the planets, and observational data to back it all up. For the Abbasids, it was an immediate and invaluable tool for timekeeping, calendar making, and determining the Qibla. But for Caliph al-Ma'mun and the scholars he patronized, to possess Ptolemy's work was not enough. They had to verify it. This impulse, the need to test inherited theory against present reality, was a profound expression of the new scientific spirit. It was one thing to revere an ancient text. It was another, far more scientific, to build the instruments and conduct the observations to see if it was actually right. To this end, al-Ma'mun commissioned the construction of the first major astronomical observatories since the time of the Greeks. At the al-Shamsiyya Observatory in Baghdad and another on Mount Cassion overlooking Damascus, his astronomers built massive, precise instruments on a scale the ancient world had never seen. They constructed huge stone sextants with radii of many meters, large quadrants for measuring stellar altitudes, and sophisticated astrolabes of brass and silver. With these powerful new tools, they embarked on a systematic project of re-observation, a meticulous redoing of the work of Ptolemy. For years, they charted the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, compiling vast new tables of data. And as they did, they discovered something astonishing. Ptolemy, the great master, had made mistakes. Their precise, repeated observations revealed that the value Ptolemy had given for the precession of the equinoxes was incorrect. They calculated the length of the solar year with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for 700 years, again finding a slight but significant error in Ptolemy's value. They remeasured the obliquity of the ecliptic, the tilt of the Earth's axis, and found that it had changed since Ptolemy's time. This was not an act of disrespect. On the contrary, it was the highest possible tribute to Ptolemy's method. They were using the rational, mathematical tools he had provided to refine and correct his conclusions. They were not just reading the language of the cosmos as written by the Greeks. They were actively listening to the universe itself and correcting the ancient grammar. The result of this monumental effort was the creation of new, highly accurate astronomical tables known as Zij. These tables, like those produced by Al-Khwarizmi himself, became the new standard for the entire Islamic world, allowing for the creation of more accurate calendars and more precise navigational tools. The scholars of the House of Wisdom had taken the most perfect scientific text of the ancient world and through rigorous, empirical effort had made it better. The pipeline was not just flowing. It was a powerful engine of refinement, taking in the raw material of ancient wisdom and outputting a stronger, purer, and more accurate product. Of all the streams of knowledge that flowed through the wisdom pipeline, none was pursued with more urgency, and none produced more immediate, tangible benefits than the science of medicine. For the caliphs and courtiers of Baghdad, a mastery of mathematics was a tool of empire, and a mastery of astronomy was a matter of faith and prestige. But a mastery of medicine was a matter of personal survival. This existential imperative drove a state-sponsored effort to acquire, translate, and, most importantly, apply the entire medical inheritance of the ancient Greeks. The figure who loomed over this entire tradition like a colossus was Galen of Pergamon, the 2nd century physician, whose vast, encyclopedic writings represented the absolute pinnacle of classical medical theory. Under the tireless direction of translators like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, virtually the entire Galenic corpus was rendered into Arabic, providing the physicians of the Islamic world with a sophisticated and coherent system for understanding the human body. Yet, just as with astronomy and mathematics, the story of Islamic medicine is not one of passive reception. The Arabic-speaking physicians who inherited Galen's work did not treat it as infallible scripture. They approached it with the critical eye of a working clinician, honoring the master by testing his theories against the realities of the sickbed. And in doing so, they transformed his ancient art into a new and more powerful science. The foundation of the entire system was Galen's theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To the modern ear, it sounds like pure superstition, but in its time, it was a complex and rational system for diagnosis and treatment. It held that health was a state of perfect balance among these four bodily fluids, and that illness was the result of an imbalance, a surplus or deficit of one humor. Every food, every herb, every climate, and every human activity was believed to affect this balance. The role of the physician was to be a master diagnostician, to identify the specific imbalance in a patient and to prescribe a course of treatment, be it a change in diet, the application of specific herbs, or the controlled practice of bloodletting that would restore the body to its natural equilibrium. This was a powerful, all-encompassing theory that provided a logical framework for every aspect of health and disease. The translation of Galen's work gave the physicians of Baghdad a complete intellectual toolkit, far surpassing the simple folk remedies that had preceded it. It gave them the language of diagnosis, the principles of pharmacology, and the confidence of a coherent, systematic approach to healing. The first great impact of this new knowledge was the creation of a professionalized medical infrastructure. The concept of the hospital as a secular institution for the care of all sick people, not just a hospice for the dying, was a Persian innovation that was enthusiastically adopted and expanded by the Abbasids. Under Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the first major hospital was established in Baghdad, staffed by physicians trained in the new Galenic tradition, many of whom were Nestorian Christians from Jundishapur. These were not just places of care, they were centers of medical education and research. They had separate wards for different ailments, an outpatient clinic, a pharmacy for compounding drugs, and a library filled with the latest translations. For the first time, medical students could learn their craft not just by reading books, but through direct clinical instruction at the patient's bedside, a practice that would not become standard in Europe for centuries. This created a virtuous cycle. The hospital was a place where Galen's theories could be systematically applied, and the results of those applications, the successes and failures observed in hundreds of patients, provided the raw data for a new wave of medical discovery. The first great figure to emerge from this new clinical environment was a man whose genius lay in his fierce, empirical spirit. Abu Bakr al-Razi, known to the West as Razis, was one of the most brilliant and original physicians of all time. Born in Persia in the mid-9th century, he eventually became the chief physician of the great Baghdad hospital. While he was a master of Galenic theory, his true loyalty was not to the ancient texts, but to what he could see with his own eyes. He was a relentless clinical observer, a man who trusted direct experience over received authority. He embodied the new critical spirit of the Golden Age, famously stating, "The words of Galen are not sacred. If the clinical evidence contradicts his theory, the clinical evidence must be followed." This was a revolutionary sentiment. It transformed medicine from a scholastic exercise in textual commentary into an empirical science. Al-Razi's greatest work, Kitab al-Hawi fil Tib, the comprehensive book on medicine, was a massive private encyclopedia compiled from his lifetime of clinical notebooks. In it, he would present a medical problem, summarize what all the Greek and Indian authorities had written on the subject, and then, crucially, add his own clinical experience and his own judgment. It was in another of his works, a treatise on smallpox and measles, Kitab al-Jadari wal Hasba, that he made his most famous contribution. For centuries, these two diseases had been conflated, seen as a single, terrifying affliction. But through careful, meticulous observation of patients in the Baghdad hospital, al-Razi was the first to provide a clear, differential diagnosis. He described the distinct signs and symptoms of each disease, their different stages of progression, and their different prognoses with a clarity and precision that remains a model of clinical description. He had taken the general framework of the Greeks and used it to create new, specific, life-saving knowledge. He was not just a translator, he was a discoverer. This spirit of synthesis and innovation reached its absolute zenith a century later with the work of another Persian polymath, Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina, known to the West by his Latinized name, Avicenna. If al-Razi was the great clinician, Ibn Sina was the supreme systematizer, a man of breathtaking intellectual power who sought to organize the entirety of human knowledge. His masterwork, Al-Qanan fil Tib, the Canon of Medicine, was arguably the single most influential book in the history of medicine. It was not a book of new, original discoveries in the manner of Al-Razi, but a monumental encyclopedia that sought to systematize all existing medical knowledge, from the Greeks to his own time, into a single, coherent, and irrefutable system. The Canon was a masterpiece of logical organization. In 5 books, it covered everything from the general principles of anatomy and physiology, based heavily on Galen, to a massive materia medica describing over 800 different drugs and their effects, to the diagnosis and treatment of specific diseases from head to toe, and finally to the complex art of compounding medicines. The genius of the Canon was its clarity, its comprehensiveness, and its sheer intellectual authority. It took the sprawling, sometimes contradictory, works of Galen and the clinical notes of Al-Razi and forged them into a single, logical, and easy-to-use reference work. It established a clear methodology for diagnosing diseases, introduced the concepts of clinical drug trials and evidence-based medicine, and provided a framework for understanding everything from the spread of contagious diseases through water and soil to the psychosomatic effects of emotion on the body. Its synthesis was so powerful, its scope so vast, that it became the definitive medical textbook for the entire civilized world. Translated into Latin in the 12th century by Gerard of Cremona, the Canon became the foundation of the medical curriculum in European universities for the next 600 years, lasting well into the 17th century. A European physician in the age of Shakespeare was, in all likelihood, still learning his craft from a textbook written by a Persian scholar in the 11th century, which was itself a brilliant synthesis and expansion of the Greek knowledge that had been funneled through the pipeline of Baghdad. The journey was complete. The art of the Greek physician had been transformed into the science of the Islamic hospital, and that science had now become the universal language of healing for the entire Western world. The wisdom pipeline carried more than just the practical sciences. It funneled in a body of knowledge that was far more abstract, more challenging, and ultimately more dangerous to the established order: Greek philosophy. While the mathematics of Euclid and the medicine of Galen were easily embraced as useful tools for a thriving empire, the philosophical works of Plato, and above all, Aristotle, presented a profound and existential challenge. They were not simply sets of data or useful techniques. They were complete, rational systems for understanding the universe, the nature of reality, and the place of humanity within it, all constructed without any reference to divine revelation. The arrival of this powerful, secular intellectual tradition in the heart of the deeply pious Islamic world sparked a century-long struggle, a fierce and brilliant debate that would pit the most brilliant minds of the age against the most fundamental questions of existence. The central problem was this: how could the truths of divinely revealed religion be reconciled with the truths of human reason? The attempt to answer this question gave rise to the great tradition of Islamic philosophy, or falsafa, a movement that not only produced thinkers of genius but also reshaped the intellectual legacy of the West. The initial impetus for translating philosophy was, like the other sciences, surprisingly pragmatic. The early Abbasid caliphs, particularly the rationalist al-Ma'mun, needed a new intellectual weapon. They were confronted with a vibrant and diverse array of faiths within their empire: Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Manichaeans, all of whom had sophisticated theological traditions and were skilled in the arts of logical debate, often using the very tools of Greek Aristotelian logic that they had inherited. To engage with and intellectually dominate these communities, Muslim theologians, the scholars of Kalam, realized they needed to master the same logical and metaphysical language as their opponents. They needed Aristotle's Organon, his 6 works on logic, to understand the rules of a proper argument, the nature of a syllogism, and the identification of logical fallacies. The initial translation of Greek philosophy was, therefore, an act of intellectual statecraft, a way of arming Islamic theology for the great debates that raged in the multicultural salons of Baghdad. But what began as a tool for theological debate soon took on a life of its own, as more and more of Aristotle's works were translated from his physics and metaphysics to his works on ethics and psychology, a new generation of thinkers began to see his philosophy not just as a set of logical tools, but as a complete and compelling path to truth. The first great figure to champion this new way of thinking was Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, often hailed as the philosopher of the Arabs. Working in the House of Wisdom in the 9th century, Al-Kindi was a polymath who wrote on everything from music and optics to medicine and mathematics. But his great project was to harmonize Greek philosophy with Islamic doctrine. He argued passionately that there could be no fundamental conflict between reason and revelation. Between Rose first Kafbolsters, he ordered Vesturhas and the Poltimlivil. He rose in full fedirizes between reason and revelation of Gamfanu, between reason and revelation of Folu Rizu, Ferzinu, Revases Heres too. The Prophet Muhammad brought truth through revelation, he argued, while Aristotle had discovered the very same truths through the power of pure, unaided human reason. He saw philosophy as the handmaiden of theology, a way to rationally prove the existence of God, the creation of the world out of nothing, ex nihilo, and the immortality of the soul. For Al-Kindi, Aristotle was not a pagan threat, but a powerful ally for a more rational and profound understanding of faith. This project was taken up with even greater sophistication by the next generation of thinkers, most notably Al-Farabi, a towering intellectual of the 10th century. Known as the second teacher, with Aristotle being the first, Al-Farabi sought to create a grand synthesis of the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle within an Islamic framework. He was deeply influenced by Plato's idea of the philosopher king, as described in the Republic. In his masterwork, The Virtuous City, Al-Farabi reimagined this concept for the Islamic world. He argued that the ideal state is one that is governed by a ruler who is both a prophet, receiving divine revelation, and a supreme philosopher, possessing a perfect rational understanding of the universe. He saw no contradiction. The prophet and the philosopher, he argued, have access to the same ultimate truths. They simply express them in different languages. The prophet through the symbolic and imaginative language of scripture, accessible to the masses, and the philosopher through the precise, logical language of demonstrative proof, accessible only to the intellectual elite. It was a brilliant and audacious attempt to create a philosophical justification for the ideal Islamic state, a vision of a society governed by both reason and faith. However, this easy harmony between philosophy and religion was not universally accepted. To many traditionalist theologians and jurists, the entire project of philosopher was deeply suspect. They saw the Greek philosophers as pagans who had reached dangerously heretical conclusions. Aristotle, for example, had argued for the eternity of the universe, which seemed to directly contradict the Quranic doctrine of a singular moment of creation by God. He had also questioned the concept of bodily resurrection, another core tenet of the faith. These contradictions created a powerful backlash. Theologians like Al-Ghazali, in his influential 11th century work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, launched a devastating attack on the pretensions of the philosopher. He argued that while logic was a useful tool, human reason was ultimately incapable of grasping the ultimate truths of metaphysics, which could only be known through the direct, experiential faith of a mystic and the acceptance of revelation. Al-Ghazali's critique was so powerful that it dealt a severe blow to the tradition of Aristotelian philosophy in the Eastern Islamic world. But just as the flame of philosophy began to flicker in the East, it was reignited with breathtaking intensity in the far West, in the sophisticated, multicultural world of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. It was here that the tradition produced its most daring and, for the West, most influential defender, Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd, known to Europe as Averroes. A 12th century physician, jurist, and astronomer from Cordoba, Ibn Rushd was the ultimate Aristotelian. He dedicated his life to writing a series of brilliant, meticulous commentaries on nearly all of Aristotle's works. His goal was to strip away centuries of Neoplatonic interpretation and to recover the pure, unadulterated rationalism of Aristotle himself. In his definitive work, The Incoherence of the Incoherence, he offered a point-by-point rebuttal of al-Ghazali's attack. Ibn Rushd's argument was radical and uncompromising. He proposed what would later be known as the doctrine of double truth. He argued that philosophy, the path of reason, and religion, the path of faith, were two separate, independent, and equally valid paths to truth. The Quran, he stated, speaks in allegories and symbols, which are necessary for the moral and spiritual guidance of the masses who are not capable of pure rational thought. Philosophy, on the other hand, uses the language of logic and demonstration to arrive at the same truths, and this is the proper path for the educated elite. When scripture and reason appear to conflict, he argued, it is because the scripture is being read too literally. The role of the philosopher is to interpret the allegorical meaning of the text to reveal its deeper, rational truth. This was a bold defense of philosophical autonomy that sent shockwaves through the Islamic and, later, the Christian world. While his uncompromising rationalism made him a controversial figure in his own culture, his meticulous commentaries on Aristotle would soon find a new and hungry audience. When the wisdom pipeline began to reverse its flow, it would be the Aristotle of Ibn Rushd, the philosopher of pure reason, who would pour into Europe and shatter the intellectual foundations of the medieval world. For centuries, the wisdom pipeline had been a one-way conduit, a vast intellectual artery, pumping the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Greek world, supercharged by the innovations of the Islamic Golden Age, into the heart of the Caliphate. The flow of ideas was almost entirely from west to east. A scholar in 9th century Baghdad had access to a library of global knowledge, while his contemporary in 9th century Paris or Aachen lived in a state of relative intellectual poverty, his world circumscribed by a handful of Latin texts. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, the geopolitical landscape of the Mediterranean began to shift. The immense, unified power of the Abbasid Caliphate had fragmented, while a new, more confident and intellectually curious Europe was beginning to emerge from its long dark age. The pipeline, which had for so long enriched the East, was about to reverse its flow, transmitting its precious cargo of enriched knowledge back to a West that was finally ready and desperately eager to receive it. This reverse transmission was not a vague process of cultural osmosis. It happened in specific places, driven by specific people, centered on two remarkable zones of cultural and intellectual cross-pollination: Islamic Spain and Norman Sicily. The primary and most important of these new centers was Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. While the rest of Europe had languished, Al-Andalus had blossomed into a civilization of extraordinary sophistication. Its great capital, Cordoba, was a city of paved streets, public baths, and magnificent libraries, most famously the great library of Caliph al-Hikma II, which was said to contain over 400,000 volumes, a number unimaginable to any Christian king. Here, the intellectual traditions of the Islamic East had flourished, producing generations of brilliant poets, physicians, astronomers, and philosophers, culminating in the towering genius of the Aristotelian commentator Ibn Rushd, Averroes. By the 11th century, however, the centralized power of the Caliphate of Cordoba had shattered, leaving Al-Andalus a patchwork of competing smaller kingdoms or taifas. This political fragmentation coincided with the beginning of the Christian reconquest of the peninsula, the Reconquista. In 1085, a pivotal event occurred. The Christian king, Alfonso VI of Castile, captured the great city of Toledo. This was more than just a military victory. It was an intellectual jackpot. The Christians of the north, who had been living on a meager diet of Latin texts, suddenly found themselves in possession of one of the great libraries of the Islamic world, a treasure trove of books not only in Arabic, but also in Hebrew. The capture of Toledo created a unique and unprecedented situation. A Christian king now ruled over a large and sophisticated population of Arabic-speaking Muslims and, equally importantly, a community of highly educated, bilingual Jews who had served as administrators, physicians, and scholars under Muslim rule. A new spirit of intellectual curiosity was rising in Europe, and scholars from across the continent, from England, Italy, France, and Germany heard tales of the immense library of Toledo, a place where one could find the lost books of the ancient Greeks, they began to make the long, arduous journey to Spain, not as crusaders but as knowledge seekers. They came for one reason: to translate. Under the patronage of Archbishop Raymond of Toledo, the city became the epicenter of the largest and most organized translation effort the West had ever known. This was not the work of a few isolated individuals, but a collaborative, multicultural enterprise. The School of Toledo, as it came to be known, was not a physical building, but a network of scholars who worked side by side in the city's libraries. The process was a mirror image of the early work in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, but in reverse. A typical translation team might consist of a local Jewish scholar who was fluent in both Arabic and the local Romance vernacular, the ancestor of modern Spanish, and a visiting Christian scholar from Europe who was a master of Latin, and a visiting Christian scholar from Europe who was a master of Latin, and a visiting Christian scholar from Europe who was a master of Latin. The Jewish scholar would read the Arabic manuscript aloud, translating it into the vernacular, and the Christian scholar would then write it down, translating the vernacular speech into the formal, scholarly Latin that would make it accessible to the rest of Europe. The sheer scale of their output was astonishing. One of the most prolific of these translators was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar who, according to his students, had traveled to Toledo specifically to find a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest. Once there, he discovered a world of knowledge beyond his wildest dreams. He dedicated the rest of his life to translating, single-handedly rendering at least 71 major Arabic works into Latin. He translated the foundational texts of science and mathematics, Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Almagest, and, crucially, the revolutionary work of Al-Khwarizmi on algebra. He translated the great works of Islamic medicine, including the massive encyclopedias of Al-Razi and the monumental canon of medicine of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, a book that would completely reshape and dominate European medical education for the next 6 centuries. And he translated the works of the philosophers, most notably Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi. Through the tireless work of men like Gerard, the intellectual core of the Islamic Golden Age was systematically transplanted, book by book, into the Latin reading world. A second, smaller, but still significant, pipeline opened up in the south, on the island of Sicily. For centuries, Sicily had been under Islamic rule, a vibrant part of the Muslim Mediterranean. In the late 11th century, it was conquered by a dynasty of Norman adventurers. But unlike the often brutal Reconquista in Spain, the Norman kings of Sicily adopted a remarkably tolerant and syncretic approach to governing. They created a unique trilingual kingdom, where the administration operated in Latin, Greek, and Arabic. The Norman court in Palermo became a dazzling fusion of cultures, where courtiers might speak Arabic, the liturgy was chanted in Greek, and the royal decrees were written in Latin. This environment, rich with the legacy of Islamic science and administration, became another key point of transmission. Scholars at the Palermo court, working under the patronage of kings like Roger II, translated key texts, particularly those related to geography and astronomy. The great Arab geographer al-Idrisi completed his masterpiece, the Tabula Rogeriana, one of the most advanced world maps of the medieval period, at the court of Roger II in Palermo. Here too, the enriched knowledge of the Islamic world was being funneled back into the mainstream of a changing Europe. This reverse flow of knowledge was not a passive process of reception. It was an active, transformative event. The arrival of these texts in Latin translation in the newly founded universities of Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salerno was like a series of intellectual explosions. The introduction of algebra provided a powerful new tool for mathematics and commerce. The arrival of the canon of medicine provided a complete systematic framework that revolutionized the teaching and practice of healing. The arrival of the Almagest provided a true, mathematical model of the cosmos for the first time in centuries. And the arrival of the great Arab philosophers, particularly the sophisticated Aristotelian commentaries of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, was perhaps the most explosive of all. His uncompromising rationalism, his insistence on the primacy of reason, and his sophisticated interpretation of Aristotle presented a profound challenge to the established order of Christian scholasticism, forcing a generation of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas to grapple with his arguments and, in doing so, to forge a new synthesis of faith and reason. The pipeline had reversed its flow, and the knowledge it delivered, saved and enriched by the Islamic world, was now providing the essential intellectual fuel for the transformation of the medieval mind. The European Renaissance, that spectacular efflorescence of art, science, and humanism that began in 14th century Italy, has long been narrated as a story of self-discovery. It is presented as a moment when Europe, after 1,000 years of medieval slumber, awoke and, by its own genius, reconnected with its long-lost classical heritage. The image is a powerful one. Florentine scholars dusting off forgotten Latin manuscripts in monastery libraries, artists in Rome gazing upon the rediscovered beauty of ancient sculptures, and a new spirit of inquiry being born from the ashes of the Roman world. This narrative, while not entirely false, is dangerously incomplete. It omits the single most critical chapter of the story, the journey that those classical texts had taken. It ignores the fact that the Renaissance was not simply a rebirth of a dormant European past, but the culmination of a vast, centuries-long process of intellectual transmission that had been mediated, curated, and profoundly enriched by the Islamic world. The Great Awakening of Europe was predicated on a hidden debt, a forgotten inheritance delivered to its doorstep by the very civilization it often saw as its rival. To understand this debt, we must revisit the intellectual state of Europe on the eve of the Renaissance. Medieval scholasticism, the dominant mode of thought for centuries, was a powerful but closed system. It was based on a limited canon of Latin texts, primarily the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the small fraction of Aristotle's works on logic that had been preserved in Latin. Its method was one of commentary and disputation, a rigorous system for reconciling faith with the limited philosophical tools at its disposal. But it was a system that was largely insulated from the empirical sciences and from the full breadth of the classical tradition. For a true intellectual revolution to occur, a massive infusion of new knowledge was required, knowledge that simply did not exist in the libraries of Paris, Oxford, or Bologna. That new knowledge, which had been acquired, translated, and expanded upon in the Islamic world, arrived via the reversed pipeline from Spain and Sicily, and it acted as a series of controlled explosions, shattering the foundations of the old scholastic world and providing the essential toolkit for the new one. Consider the field of science. Medieval Europe's understanding of the natural world was based largely on encyclopedia-like summaries from Latin authors like Pliny, which were often a garbled mixture of fact, folklore, and fantasy. The arrival of the translated works from Arabic changed everything. The complete works of Aristotle, especially his Physics, on the heavens and on generation and corruption, reintroduced the concept of a systematic, rational inquiry into the natural world. Ptolemy's Almagest, translated from Arabic by Gerard of Cremona, provided a complete, predictive mathematical model of the cosmos for the first time, replacing myth with mathematics and stimulating the astronomical inquiries of figures like Copernicus centuries later. But it was not just the rediscovered Greek texts that mattered, it was the new, original works of Islamic scholars. The introduction of Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra, Al-Jabr, provided European mathematicians with a powerful new symbolic language for calculation, an essential tool for the coming scientific and commercial revolutions. The brilliant work on optics by Ibn al-Haytham, Al-Hazan, with its modern, experimental approach to vision, directly influenced later Renaissance thinkers, including Leonardo da Vinci and Johannes Kepler. Europe did not just rediscover the science of the Greeks. It inherited a more advanced, more mathematical, and more empirically rigorous version of it, a version that had been pressure-tested and upgraded in the laboratories and observatories of the Islamic world. In medicine, the impact was perhaps even more immediate and profound. The medical schools that had begun to form in places like Salerno and Montpellier were hamstrung by a lack of systematic knowledge. The arrival of the Latin translation of Ibn Sina's, Avicenna's, Canon of Medicine was a seismic event. It was not just another book. It was a complete, logically organized, and encyclopedic system of medical knowledge that was vastly superior to anything that existed in Europe. It provided a coherent framework for anatomy, physiology, diagnosis, and pharmacology. It became the foundational text of European medical education, the undisputed authority for centuries. When we see the famous anatomical drawings of the Renaissance, like those of Vesalius, we are seeing a tradition that was, in a very real sense, a debate with and a reaction to the legacy of Ibn Sina. The canon provided the systematic foundation that European medicine both built upon and eventually pushed against. Without the pipeline that brought the work of Ibn Sina and al-Khwarizmi to the West, the development of European medicine from a craft into a university-taught science is simply unimaginable. The most explosive and transformative cargo of the pipeline, however, was philosophy, specifically the rigorous, uncompromising Aristotelianism of Ibn Rushd, Averroes. His meticulous, brilliant commentaries on Aristotle, translated into Latin, arrived in the newly founded universities of Paris and Oxford in the 13th century and caused an intellectual firestorm. Averroes presented a vision of Aristotle as a philosopher of pure reason, and he championed the radical idea of the double truth, the notion that philosophy and religion were separate but equally valid paths to understanding reality. This was a direct challenge to the entire scholastic project, which sought to subordinate philosophy to theology. Averroism, as the movement came to be known, was seen as a profound threat by the church authorities, who repeatedly condemned his works. But they could not stop the spread of his ideas. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas were forced to engage directly with Averroes's powerful arguments, to grapple with his pure, unadulterated Aristotle. Aquinas's great synthesis, the Summa Theologica, which would become the bedrock of Catholic theology, was in large part a monumental effort to domesticate this new, radical Aristotle that had been reintroduced to Europe through the lens of its greatest Islamic commentator. Averroes, in effect, forced Europe to confront the full, challenging power of rational inquiry, a confrontation that sharpened its philosophical tools and laid the intellectual groundwork for the secular humanism of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, then, was not a miracle. It was an inheritance. It was the moment when Europe finally became the primary beneficiary of the knowledge that had been saved, synthesized, and expanded by the Islamic Golden Age. The Florentine humanist who read Plato, the Paduan physician who studied the canon, the Parisian philosopher who debated Averroes, and the Nuremberg astronomer who used the corrected astronomical tables were all, whether they knew it or not, the downstream recipients of the wisdom pipeline. The Duros des Beakers, for Duros Muffinsteers, House Duros, Herzurers, Eurothers. The downstream recipients of the wisdom pipeline. Their work was made possible by the caliphs who had funded the translations in 9th century Baghdad, by the Christian translator Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who had created a scientific vocabulary for Arabic, by the genius of Al-Khwarizmi and Ibn Sina, and by the multicultural teams of scholars who had toiled in the libraries of 12th century Toledo. To ignore this hidden debt is to misunderstand the very nature of progress. It is to imagine that a flame can be lit without the spark that preceded it. The Renaissance was not just Europe rediscovering its own past. It was Europe finally catching up to the knowledge of a rival civilization, an inheritance that provided the critical spark that would set the Western world ablaze. Our investigation has demonstrated that the Islamic Golden Age, one of the most brilliant intellectual epochs in human history, was ignited by a conscious and deliberate act of cultural acquisition. It was the direct result of a wisdom pipeline, a state-sponsored, systematic project that rescued the endangered scientific and philosophical heritage of the classical Greek world. We have shown that the early Abbasid caliphs, driven by the practical necessities of building and administering a global empire, invested vast resources to locate, purchase, and translate the foundational texts of Greek medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. This monumental effort, centered at the legendary House of Wisdom in Baghdad, was a multicultural enterprise where Christian and Muslim scholars worked side by side to forge a new scientific language for the Arabic-speaking world. Crucially, we have argued that this was not an act of passive preservation. The scholars of the Islamic world were active and critical participants in the knowledge they inherited. They did not simply become custodians of the Greek legacy, they became its innovators. They pressure-tested the astronomical data of Ptolemy and corrected it through rigorous observation. They synthesized the geometry of Euclid with numerals from India to create the new and powerful language of algebra. They took the medical theories of Galen, refined them with their own clinical observations, and created new, life-saving diagnoses and encyclopedic systems of knowledge. They engaged the pagan philosophy of Aristotle, challenging it and using it to forge a new and sophisticated tradition of rationalist inquiry. Finally, we have followed this enriched and expanded body of knowledge as the pipeline reversed its flow. Through the great translation centers of Toledo and Sicily, this intellectual treasury containing not just the rescued works of the Greeks, but also the transformative new discoveries of Islamic science and philosophy, was transmitted back into a reawakening Europe. This reverse transmission, we have argued, provided the essential and often unacknowledged intellectual toolkit that challenged medieval scholasticism and helped to fuel the scientific and philosophical revolutions of the European Renaissance. The wisdom pipeline was therefore not a simple one-way transfer, but a remarkable round-trip journey. It was a bridge across centuries that saved the foundational knowledge of the West, profoundly enhanced it through the genius of another civilization, and then delivered it back to ignite a new age.